The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat that had been running too long without maintenance. Mercy General's night shift was quiet at 2 in the morning, the kind of quiet that came before the chaos, the lull before the screaming started. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a scent so embedded in the walls that no amount of cleaning could ever remove it. Natalie Hayes moved through the corridor with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact walk 10,000 times. Scrubs. Badge clipped at chest level. Hair pulled back so tight it didn't move when she turned her head. She was the kind of nurse that doctors forgot about 5 minutes after she left the room, not because she was incompetent, but because competence at 3 in the morning meant nothing went wrong, and when nothing went wrong, nobody noticed you. She had been at Mercy General for 7 years. 7 years of night shifts. 7 years of keeping her head down. 7 years of absolutely no history offered up voluntarily. The emergency department bay doors rolled open on her approach. She didn't break stride. The smell of diesel exhaust rolled in from the ambulance bay outside, mixing with the antiseptic until the air tasted like metal and chemical fire. She had worked long enough to know what that smell meant, incoming. The radio crackled confirmation before she could reach the trauma bay. Multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 40. Too critical. ETA 12 minutes. She began setting up the station without being asked, knowing the steps the way other people knew how to breathe. Trauma shears with her call sign barely visible on the handle, worn smooth from years of use. She tucked them into her pocket the way she had done every single night for longer than she could calculate. Nobody ever noticed the shears. Nobody noticed much of anything about Natalie Hayes except that the paperwork was always correct and the patient somehow survived when the odds said they shouldn't. Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived at the hospital the way he arrived at everything, through the front entrance, coffee in hand, expecting the world to arrange itself around him. He had been at Mercy General for 4 years, long enough to reshape the department into the kingdom he preferred. The hierarchy was simple in his mind, surgeons at the top, where they belonged. Nurses somewhere below that. Night shift nurses even lower still, because they worked when the important people slept. He had made it clear during his first week that he preferred his staff compliant and, more importantly, forgettable. "I don't need to know their names," he had told the attending physician on his second day. "I need them to anticipate my needs before I have to speak them. That's all." The attending had smiled and nodded as if this was wisdom instead of narcissism. By the time Hargrove had settled into his routine, the department had reconfigured itself around his preferences like iron filings around a magnet. He was particular about hierarchy. He had rewritten the protocol handbook in the first month, inserting sections that made clear the chain of command. Surgeons consulted with attending physicians. Attending physicians consulted with residents. Residents consulted with nurses only when absolutely necessary, and then only for information retrieval, not collaboration. "We are not a democracy," he had said during grand rounds. "We are a surgical unit. Someone has to be in charge." That someone was always him. Natalie had learned the rhythms of his preferences quickly. When he entered a room, she moved to the wall and stood with her hands folded. When he asked a question, she answered in exactly 8 words or fewer. When he made decisions that she felt were incorrect, and there had been 3 occasions in 4 years where she was certain he was wrong, she said nothing and made preparations for what she knew was coming. 2 of those 3 patients had complicated. 1 had recovered despite the initial orders. She had learned a long time ago that speaking up was not compatible with going unnoticed. The trauma bay was ready by the time Hargrove arrived. Natalie had already pulled the crash cart closer. She had already verified the ventilator settings. She had already drawn up the medications that would be needed in 60 seconds, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if they were lucky and the bleeding wasn't as bad as the radio suggested. Hargrove took one look at the setup and nodded curtly. "Acceptable," he said, which was his version of gratitude. The next 4 hours moved in controlled bursts. The first patient arrived with a pneumothorax and 3 fractured ribs. Hargrove intubated. Natalie handed him the tube before he asked for it. The second patient arrived with abdominal trauma. Natalie was already typing blood work into the system before Hargrove finished his preliminary assessment. By the time the sun started to think about rising over Raleigh, both patients were stable and Hargrove was signing off on their transfers to ICU. He left the trauma bay without acknowledging the work that had happened around him, which meant the work was beneath acknowledgement. This was how Mercy General functioned: brilliance at the top, efficiency at the bottom, and neither side looking directly at the other. Natalie was standing at the sink washing her hands, the water running so hot it was starting to turn her knuckles red, when the radio crackled again. Not an ambulance this time. Something official. Something that made the dispatcher's voice change into a register that meant federal. Mercy General, this is Delta Base 1. We have a medical transport arriving at your location within 20 minutes. Colonel James Mitchell, Delta Force Operations Command. We are requesting the surgeon who served in Helmand Province, 2017 to 2019 rotation. Specifically the surgeon attached to Shadow Squadron. This is a priority request. The radio crackled silent. Natalie's hands stopped moving. The water was still running, scalding her skin, but she didn't pull her hands away. In the glass reflection above the sink, she could see the other nurses in the break room looking up from their charts. The Delta Force call sign had done something to the energy in the hospital. Money moved through Mercy General, but power was what they rarely saw. Delta Force was the kind of power that made people sit straighter. Hargrove was in his office when the message was relayed. Natalie watched from her station as he straightened his tie and began moving toward the trauma bay with the gait of a man walking toward his destiny. He had never served. Natalie knew this because she had access to the staff files as part of her credentialing. But he had read enough medical journals written by combat surgeons to feel qualified. He had read enough, and he had the title, and he had the rank, which in his calculation meant he had the right to receive credit for things he had never done. The trauma bay doors opened at 6:19 a.m. The morning light was still pale and uncertain through the upper windows. Hargrove strode into the room with his hand already extended, ready to greet whatever colonel had just arrived demanding his presence. The man who walked in was not young. He was maybe 55, maybe older, with the kind of face that showed every mile of every deployment. He wore his uniform like he had been born in it. His eye swept across the trauma bay in one professional arc, taking in the setup, the equipment, the staff arranged against the walls. His eyes landed on Natalie and stopped there. The colonel's expression changed. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes, just a straightening of the spine that went beyond military bearing, but it was there. He walked past Hargrove's extended hand. He walked directly toward Natalie without breaking eye contact. Natalie did not move. She did not flinch. The cardinal rule of the night shift was that you stayed small, stayed invisible, stayed in the background. But something in the way the colonel was looking at her suggested that the rules might be about to change. The colonel's sleeve rode up as he raised his arm. The tattoo started at his wrist and traced upward in clean military lettering, Natalie Marie Hayes, Senior Chief. The colonel's sleeve rode up as he raised his arm. The tattoo started at his wrist and traced upward in clean military lettering, Natalie Marie Hayes, Senior Chief. The room didn't move. The family didn't breathe. Dr. Hargrove's face drained the color of old bone. He looked at Natalie. Then at the name on the colonel's arm. Then back at Natalie, who stood motionless beside the stretcher with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the monitor's steady rhythm. "You," Hargrove said. His voice came out thin. "Where did you work before this?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The colonel was already pulling up his sleeve, tracing the letters like they were braille, like he could read the story through his fingertips. Hargrove moved to the filing cabinet mounted on the wall. 3 drawers. He yanked the employment file open and pulled her application from 2017. His hand shook as he scrolled down the page. Prior military service, no. Checked the box himself. Signed her name. Natalie Marie Hayes, RN. The lie was there in permanent ink. Not in what she'd written, but in what she'd left blank. "You told me no prior service," he said. His voice climbed. You wrote it. You signed it. I didn't lie, Natalie said. Her voice was steady as a metronome. I was never asked who I used to be. Who you used to be? Hargrove stepped toward her. You're a fraud. A liar. You filled out federal employment documents with false information. His eyes darted to the colonel's family, his wife, his adult daughter, the teenage grandson, all of them watching the scene unfold like a play with no intermission. This is what happens when we stop vetting people properly. This is what happens when we hire based on need instead of character. The colonel's wife moved closer to her husband. A protective gesture. She didn't understand the tattoo yet. She didn't understand why a small woman in scrubs with calloused hands and a scar that ran from her collarbone to her ribs had her husband's name written in permanent ink across his skin. Get out of this room, Hargrove said to Natalie. His voice had found its weapon now. You're done here. You're suspended from patient care, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The hospital will be contacting legal. You're looking at fraud charges, misrepresentation of credentials, endangerment. Do you understand? Natalie turned to the colonel. For 3 seconds, they looked at each other. His eyes were searching her face like he was trying to match it to a memory that wouldn't surface. She was different now. 7 years quieter. 7 years softer. The woman who'd carried him through Sanjin Valley wasn't wearing scrubs and a name badge. That woman had a uniform. A rank. A purpose. This woman had chosen to be nobody. I'm going to need you to pack your things, Hargrove continued, his voice climbing toward something that sounded almost hysterical. He was addressing Natalie but watching the family. Playing to them. This was his audience now. This was his chance to show them that hierarchy still meant something. That the doctor was still the doctor, and the nurse was still just the nurse. And I'm going to need you to give me your badge. He walked out before she could respond. The door swung shut behind him with the gentle hiss of hydraulic pressure. Natalie reached up and unpinned her name badge. 6 years it had been clipped to her scrubs. 6 years of invisibility. She held it in her palm for a moment, her picture from 2017, smiling at the camera like she was a normal person with a normal life and no classified missions in her medical file. She set it on the bedside table next to the colonel's for drip. The morning shift didn't know yet. That came at 6:08 a.m. when Hargrove posted the write-up on the unit board in the break room, printed in size 18 font so nobody could miss it. He'd laminated it. Made it permanent. Like he was preserving evidence. Formal disciplinary action. Employee, Natalie Marie Hayes, RN. Violations, fraudulent credential claims, falsification of employment documents, patient boundary violations, practicing outside scope of licensure. Status, suspension pending termination review. Date, effective immediately. Approved by Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Department Director. The nurses who'd laughed at her jokes yesterday, Sarah from nights, Jen from the weekend rotation, Kevin who always stole her coffee from the staff fridge, they clustered around it like it was a breaking news alert. Their eyes went wide. Their mouths moved silently. Then Natalie walked in. 6:52 a.m. She was carrying her things in a cardboard box. Her stethoscope. The trauma shears she'd had for 7 years. 3 granola bars she'd kept in her locker. A photo of her son taken his first day of high school, wearing a shirt 3 sizes too big and a smile that belonged to a kid who didn't know his mother had ever been anyone dangerous. She sat down at the break room table. Sarah made a noise in her throat. Like a small animal caught in a trap. She gathered her yogurt and her keys. Jen followed. Then Kevin. Then the registry nurse who'd subbed last week. Within 90 seconds, she was alone at a table designed for 8, and the break room smelled like abandonment. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She didn't cry. She opened the granola bar and ate it slowly, watching the second hand of the wall clock complete its rotation. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. At 7:06 a.m., Hargrove came back. He had security with him. They looked uncomfortable. One of them was a veteran, she could see it in his spine. The way he stood. The way his eyes looked at nothing. "Your badge," Hargrove said. She'd already left it in the patient room. She didn't tell him that. She just stood and picked up the cardboard box. As she passed the veteran guard, she felt his eyes land on her face. Hold there. Long enough that she thought he might say something. But Hargrove was watching. The moment shattered. The guard looked away. 3 hours later, Hargrove called the colonel's house. Some question about medication. Some reason to re-establish contact. The colonel's daughter answered. She asked why he was calling. Hargrove mentioned, almost casually, that the nurse who'd been taking care of her father had been dismissed from the hospital due to credential fraud. She'd lied on her employment application. She'd misrepresented her qualifications. Her medical decisions during her tenure would need to be reviewed for safety. He was planting seeds. Creating doubt. Making sure that whatever gratitude the colonel felt would be poisoned by the time legal got involved. But what Hargrove didn't know was that the colonel's daughter had looked up the tattoo. She'd asked her father about it. He'd told her that Natalie had been his medic in Afghanistan. That she'd saved his life. He didn't have the details anymore. Helmand Province was a fog of morphine and blood loss and fever dreams, but he knew this. His sergeant had carried him 3 miles on her back. His sergeant had put her hands inside his chest in a collapsed compound and kept him breathing with a needle and pure refusal to let him die. His sergeant had been the best officer he'd ever served under. And somehow, that sergeant had become a night nurse in Raleigh, North Carolina, working for a doctor who thought she was a liar. The colonel called the hospital at 7:38 a.m. He asked to speak with Dr. Hargrove. When Hargrove picked up the line, the colonel said only 7 words, "I need to know the truth." 23 minutes later, Hargrove was in the colonel's hospital room, and the colonel was showing him the wound. The scar tissue where Natalie had decompressed his chest with a hollow needle and 30 seconds before his heart would have stopped forever. Where her hands had held him together while concrete crumbled around them and the world turned to fire. Hargrove's face did something complicated. Fear. Anger. Calculation. He left without apologizing. He had work to do. That afternoon, he started pulling footage from the security system. He wanted to find something. Something he could use. Something that proved she was dangerous, incompetent, unqualified. Something that would stick. He was looking for her error. But she didn't make errors. By evening, Natalie was sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, holding her cardboard box. Rain hammered the windshield like shrapnel. Her phone sat on the passenger seat. No calls. No texts. No one checking if she was okay. She'd been invisible for so long that disappearing felt like coming home. She put the car in drive. She needed to see a doctor. Not about the job. About the dreams that had come back. The sound of mortar fire that the hospital monitor no longer could disguise. The weight of a man on her back that she still carried 7 years later. She needed to walk into the VA hospital on Fayetteville Street and sit in a waiting room with veterans whose lives she'd saved, and raise her hand and say she needed help too. The intake form asked her to describe her trauma. She sat in a plastic chair, pen in hand, and couldn't write a single word. Because to write it down meant to claim it. To claim it meant the quiet had been a lie. She'd been a senior chief petty officer. She'd trained men and women whose names were classified. She'd performed emergency surgery in a compound while bullets punctured the walls. She'd carried her colonel 3 miles through a minefield and kept him alive by refusal alone. And then she'd walked away. Changed her name on paperwork to just a nurse. Moved to Raleigh. Work nights. Became invisible. She'd thought that meant she was healed. She'd been wrong. One tear slid down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand while a woman across the waiting room pretended not to watch. She set the pen down. She would come back tomorrow. She would fill out the form. But not today. Today she needed to breathe. The shift starts like any other Thursday night at Mercy General. Natalie moves through the cardiac unit at 11:38 p.m., checking monitors, adjusting drips, her scrubs invisible against the darkness of the hallway. A post-op patient from the morning's bypass surgery, 73-year-old named Patterson, sits in room 412 with his wife asleep in the visitor's chair beside him. His chest rises and falls. Monitors tick their steady rhythm. Normal. Stable. Safe. She's 3 steps past his door when the sound changes. A wet, gurgling gasp. Not a cough. Not sleep apnea. The specific sound of a man drowning in his own blood. Natalie doesn't run. Running causes panic. She walks back into the room with her hand already reaching for the call button, her eyes already cataloguing what her brain has already decided: tamponade. Fluid pressing against the heart. The surgical site bleeding into the pericardial sac. Every second the fluid accumulates is a second his heart has less room to beat. Patterson's wife jerks awake. Something's wrong. Something's. I've got this. Natalie's voice drops. Not louder. Lower. A frequency that makes people listen. She hits the code button and speaks into the phone with the precision of someone who has directed trauma in combat zones. Post-op bleed, room 412. I need Hargrove and a crash cart. Now. She pulls the blood pressure cuff. 92/60 and dropping. His oxygen sat reads 88. Falling. The heart monitor shows a tachycardic flutter, a bird trapped in a cage that's getting smaller by the second. Patterson's eyes go wide with the specific terror of a man whose body is betraying him. Breathe, Natalie says. It's not a request. She threads and foot into his left arm with her left hand while pulling on gloves with her right, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving like they're operating independent of conscious thought. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. You're not dying tonight. The crash cart arrives pushed by a night resident named Chen. Hargrove follows 30 seconds later, still buttoning his shirt, his face wearing the expression of a man who has been interrupted from something important. He looks at Patterson's monitor, looks at the dropping oxygen sat, looks at the distended neck veins that tell him the pressure inside the chest is climbing toward crisis. For exactly 1 second, his competence shows. Then he sees Natalie already has 2 4s running and his expression hardens. Step back. Hargrove's voice carries the weight of institutional authority. I'll handle it. Natalie doesn't acknowledge him. She's already prepping, her movements precise as a dancer who knows every step by muscle memory, not thought. She reaches for the crash cart, grabs a 14-gauge needle, the kind you use when time is measured in seconds instead of minutes. Chen watches her hands. The night resident watches her hands. Something in the room has shifted, the air pressure changed, the way it changes when apex predators move through a space. Page cardiology, Hargrove barks at Chen. We need to get him to the OR. Stat. No time, Natalie says. She doesn't shout. The words land in the room like stones dropped in still water. Tamponade. Cardiac output's tanking. He arrests before we get a surgical team, he's gone. I am aware of the diagnosis, Nurse Hayes. Hargrove's jaw sets tight. He doesn't like being corrected in his own department. Get him prepped for transport. Now. But Patterson's oxygen sat has dropped to 82. His blood pressure reads 84/58. The monitor shows a heart rate of 141 and climbing, a man's physiology screaming that something is catastrophically wrong. He's not going to make it to the OR. He's not going to make it to the elevator. Natalie moves. She locates the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the spot where the needle goes if you want to buy time for a dying man. She swabs the skin with antiseptic, feels the cold sting of it, and her hand steady. This is what she trained for. Not in a nursing textbook. In a crumbling compound in Sanjin Valley with incoming fire and a colonel bleeding out 2 feet away. She knows how to save people when there's nothing left but you and a needle and the will to not let someone die. What are you doing? Hargrove steps forward. His voice carries threat now. Step away from the patient. Natalie doesn't answer. She inserts the needle through the chest wall into the pericardial sac, and the hiss of air escaping is the sound of a man getting a second chance. Blood and fluid drain through the needle. The pressure releases. Patterson's chest visibly relaxes, his breathing eases, the desperate gasping stops. The oxygen sac climbs. 75, 82, 88, 92. Stable. The heart rate drops from 141 to 118. Still tachycardic but no longer crashing. The blood pressure rises. 92/64. 98/68. Moving in the direction of life instead of death. Chen's eyes have gone wide. The night resident's hand covers her mouth. Neither of them has ever seen a nurse do what Natalie just did, the way she did it, the absolute absence of hesitation that comes from having done it before, when the stakes were measured in lives instead of protocols. Hargrove's face has gone pale. Not from medical shock. From the realization that something has just happened in his department that he cannot control, cannot explain, cannot fit into his hierarchy. A nurse just performed a cardiac procedure without his permission, without his order, in direct contradiction to everything he has structured his power around. I need to speak with you. His voice is quiet now, but it carries a different kind of menace. After your shift. My office. Natalie doesn't respond. She's already calling for the actual cardiology team, already managing the post-procedure care, already giving Patterson's wife instructions on what comes next. Her hands are steady. Her voice is level. She doesn't look at Hargrove once. But everyone in that room understands what they just witnessed. A moment where the careful fiction of who Natalie Hayes actually is cracked just wide enough for the light to pour through. The phone in Hargrove's pocket vibrates. He steps into the hallway to take the call, and his voice carries back through the door, speaking to someone at the administrative level, someone with power he can leverage. An emergency board meeting. An investigation. A private investigator. The words fraudulent credentials and patient safety violation and scope of practice landing like grenades, because what he cannot control, he will destroy. Natalie finishes her charting at 12:38 a.m. Patterson's wife squeezes her hand and says, "Thank you. Thank you for saving him." She doesn't know what she just thanked her for, not really. No one does. The monitors tick their steady rhythm. The hallway outside is quiet. But in that quiet, careers are being dismantled by a man who just realized that the nurse he hired to be invisible has become the one person in this building who actually knows how to hold a life together when everything else is falling apart. What Hargrove doesn't know, what nobody in that hospital understands yet, is that the real nightmare is only just beginning. The next 48 hours will destroy everything he has built. But first, she has to sit in his office and listen to him try to convince her that saving a man's life was a crime. The 48 hours after Patterson woke up asking for her were the most calculated destruction of a human being that Mercy General had ever witnessed, though nobody in administration would remember it that way later. Hargrove's hands shook as he made the first call from his office at 6:19 p.m., the pericardiocentesis still replaying in his mind like a video he couldn't stop rewinding. Not the procedure itself, that part was forgettable, just emergency medicine, anyone could have done it. What he couldn't unsee was the room's reaction. The way the entire trauma team had stepped back. The way Patterson's monitor climbed from 82 to 91 to 96 oxygen saturation in 43 seconds. The way nobody had questioned her next move. The hospital administrator answered on the second ring. James Whitmore. The man owed Hargrove 3 years of silence about a botched hysterectomy that should have ended Whitmore's tenure in 2019. James, we have a problem. Hargrove said, his voice steady as a scalpel held by a surgeon who'd done this 10,000 times. Not anger. Never anger. Competence. Authority. The kind of man who made problems disappear. Within the hour, the board member whose daughter Hargrove had mentored through medical school received a call. One call. The daughter was in her second year of residency now, and Hargrove had written every recommendation letter, opened every door. A man who accumulated favors the way other men accumulated wealth. The private investigator came recommended by someone who owed Hargrove a different kind of debt entirely, someone whose DEA record had vanished under circumstances that would never be explained. By midnight, the investigator had Natalie's social security number and a mandate: find the fabrication. She watched all of this from the break room while her shift ended, sitting at the table where she'd eaten lunch for 3 years with nurses who'd stopped making eye contact the moment Hargrove's formal write-up appeared on the unit board, laminated and public, her name written in the cold language of institutional betrayal. Fraudulent credential claims and patient boundary violations. Framed like she'd stepped outside her scope, like she'd invaded something sacred. But the truth underneath the language was worse: she'd demonstrated competence that Hargrove couldn't control. She'd saved a life with tools that didn't require his permission. At 7:15 a.m. the next morning, before her shift even officially began, an email landed in her inbox with the subject line marked urgent, administrative leave. The words floated on the screen like evidence: following the incident in Trauma Bay 4, we are implementing immediate suspension pending investigation into credential verification and scope of practice violations. This is a precautionary measure and does not indicate fault. Precautionary. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She cleaned out her locker in 17 minutes. Badge, stethoscope, the small pharmacy of medication she kept for her migraines, the photo of her son at his middle school graduation she'd kept turned face down so nobody would ask questions about why she was raising him alone. At the bottom, beneath her spare socks, she found the combat boots. The one she'd meant to throw away 6 years ago. Worn leather the color of old blood. Insoles compressed into the exact shape of her feet. Laces still tied in a double knot, the kind that held through rappelling and firefights and running toward explosions while everyone else was running away. She picked them up. Put them back down. Her hands moved with the kind of deliberation that soldiers learned: nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. But she wasn't a soldier anymore. She was a nurse on administrative leave with a forged employment history and a private investigator digging through her life like a forensic pathologist. The rain found her 3 hours later, and it didn't stop. She sat in the waiting room of the Raleigh Veterans Affairs Hospital at 10:38 a.m. on a Thursday, holding an intake form with a question that had only one honest answer. Please describe your trauma in detail. The pen trembled in her hand, not from fear, but from the specific weight of memory that had learned how to hide. Around her, 7 other veterans waited for their appointments. 2 of them she recognized. She'd treated the first one, Peterson, when shrapnel from an IED had opened his left leg down to the femur. She'd taught him how to breathe through pain as information. The second one, a woman with a prosthetic arm, had been under her care for 3 weeks in Kandahar before being transferred stateside. They sat 10 feet from her and didn't see her at all. That was the cruelty of it. She could walk into any VA hospital in America, and the men and women she'd held together with her hands would walk past her like a stranger. She stared at the blank space on the form. Please describe your trauma. 7 years of Helmand Province compressed into a single paragraph. 7 years of watching people bleed out from wounds she couldn't fix fast enough. 7 years of holding a colonel's hand while his leg hung at an angle that meant amputation, whispering his name over and over because sometimes a human voice was the only tourniquet strong enough to keep someone from drowning in shock. She wrote nothing. The rain hammered the windows outside. She could hear it, the percussion of water against glass that sounded like something harder, something that left impact. The waiting room was warm, fluorescent lights casting everything in the pale color of institutional fluoride. Her hands were steady now. The tremor had passed. It always did, eventually. But she held the combat boots in her lap, and the form stayed blank, and the 7 other veterans didn't recognize her, and the person she used to be, the one whose name had been sewn into uniforms and called across radios and written in tattoos on other people's skin, felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Her phone vibrated at 2:22 p.m. A text from an unknown number. "This is Admiral Chen. JSOC received notice of your suspension. Sending a helicopter. ETA Mercy General Helipad, 6 p.m. hours." She stared at the message. Reread it. Stared at it again. And then she heard it. At first it was just a tremor in the air, the kind of vibration that made the water in the waiting room's coffee maker ripple. But within 30 seconds, it grew louder. A mechanical roar that cut through the rain like something that didn't acknowledge weather. She knew that sound. UH-60M Black Hawk. Military specification. The kind of helicopter that carried rescue teams and commandos and operators who moved through the world like apex predators wearing olive drab and titanium armor. Coming for her. At Mercy General. At 6:11 p.m., which was 15 minutes after her shift would have ended if she still had a shift to end. She was still sitting in the VA waiting room when the sound reached her, but the moment the rotor wash hit the hospital windows 3 miles away, everything that had been falling apart began to snap into alignment like bullets finding chambers. The rain kept falling. She held the blank intake form in one hand and the combat boots in the other, and for the first time in 48 hours, she allowed herself to breathe. The intake form slipped from her fingers and scattered across the vinyl chair. Rain hammered the parking lot windows of the VA hospital like distant artillery fire. She sat motionless, palms flat on her thighs, breathing the way the instructors had taught her, box breathing, for counts in, for counts hold, for counts out, the same technique she'd used in the compound in Helmand Province when the room was collapsing around her and 3 soldiers had already stopped moving. The boots. She'd wrapped them in a grocery bag and hidden them in the attic after she'd signed her discharge papers. Couldn't look at them. Couldn't throw them away either. They were laced with the dust of a life she'd abandoned. Her phone vibrated once. A text from the charge nurse at Mercy General, "Don't come in tomorrow." Hargrove filed the termination paperwork. Security got the new locks changed on your employee in trance. 48 hours. That's how long it took for him to weaponize every connection he had, the board member whose daughter he'd mentored, the administrator he'd covered for when the malpractice settlement needed burying. She'd saved that post-op patient's life with a needle and a syringe from a crash cart, and somehow that act of medical competence had become the evidence he needed to bury her. The automatic doors to the VA lobby hissed open behind her. Footsteps. Urgent ones. She didn't turn around. There was nothing left to turn around for. Natalie Hayes? A voice. Young, breathless. Her 16-year-old son Marcus stood in the threshold, soaked through his jacket, holding a shadow box against his chest like a shield. His eyes, God, his eyes had his father's shape but her mother's intensity. He was gasping like he'd run the entire distance from the parking lot. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers materialized through the rain. Delta Force insignia. Tactical vest still wet from the helicopter that must have landed somewhere in this city, somewhere close enough to send them sprinting through a downpour. "Mom, they need to see these." Marcus didn't ask. He just opened the case. The medals caught the fluorescent lighting. Bronze Star with V device. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor. 2 purple hearts arranged in descending rows. The ribbons had faded slightly, 7 years in an attic will do that, but the metalwork gleamed with the kind of durability that only comes from making something meant to survive, meant to matter. The charge nurse station erupted. 2 RNS stood up. A phlebotomist actually stepped backward. A hospital security guard, 63 years old, weathered face, the kind of bearing that comes from wearing a uniform when you were younger, straightened his spine and whispered so quietly that only those closest heard him, Senior Chief Petty Officer. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. Recognition is a verb that carries weight. The colonel stepped forward. He was shorter than she remembered, or maybe she'd grown taller in the years since Helmand, or maybe trauma just stretches people in ways that have nothing to do with centimeters. His hands trembled as he took the shadow box from Marcus. He didn't open it further. He just read, his voice cracking on the second citation. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor. He paused. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Bronze Star with V device. His eyes were watering now, and he didn't make any attempt to hide it. Purple Heart. 2 Purple Hearts. Behind him, a man in black tactical gear with SEAL Team insignia stitched onto his collar stepped into the circle. His presence made the air pressure change. This was the kind of man who'd learned to move through the world with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades solving problems that most people couldn't even name. Senior Chief Hayes saved 14 men in classified operations across Helmand Province. His voice carried the weight of command. Including this colonel. She performed emergency needle decompression on him in a crumbling compound. 3 miles under fire. On her back. He looked directly at Natalie. Senior Chief Hayes held the highest tactical medical qualification in special operations. There are surgeons at Walter Reed who trained under her. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the rain changing patterns against the glass. Hargrove wasn't there. He was at Mercy General, behind his locked office door, making phone calls, leveraging connections, calling in favors that had been owed to him for years. But someone had texted him photos. Someone had sent him the shadow box image. His response would be immediate, escalating, desperate. What she didn't know was that the hospital's IT specialist, a Marine Corps veteran named Thomas Chen who'd spent 3 years maintaining security systems before deploying, then 4 years maintaining them after, had already walked into the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Raleigh field office with a flash drive containing time-stamped security footage of Dr. Hargrove in his office at 11:08 p.m. attempting to delete the camera feed from Trauma Bay 3. The footage showed him manually corrupting the file. The footage showed him altering the incident report. The footage showed him erasing evidence of a life-saving procedure performed by hands that outranked his credentials by a margin he couldn't measure. By the time the FBI special agents arrived at Mercy General in unmarked sedan, Hargrove was in his office signing severance paperwork. Not his choice. The hospital administrator's attorney was already on the phone with the medical board. 2 states. The licenses were already suspended pending revocation. Federal charges would take approximately 36 hours to finalize. Evidence tampering. Fraud. Obstruction of justice. When you've spent 23 years climbing a hierarchy that depends on people not knowing who you really are, it takes approximately 30 seconds for that hierarchy to collapse when they finally do. Within 1 month, Dr. Marcus Hargrove was stripped of his medical licenses in North Carolina and Virginia. He faced federal indictment. The hospital system issued a statement about protocols violation and institutional accountability. But that wasn't the real punishment. The real punishment came 6 weeks later when Natalie walked past the community college on Fayetteville Street and saw a flyer taped to the window, CPR certification classes, instructor Steve H. $18 per hour. She didn't look inside. But she heard later that he flinched every time someone called him doctor. That he'd told the community college director his name was Steve now. That he'd moved to Arizona and worked nights so fewer people would recognize him. The final image stays sharp in your mind because some moments are too precise to fade. Natalie standing in her restored scrubs, the ones Hargrove had tried to take from her, beside the colonel's hospital bed. Marcus's hand on her shoulder. Not trembling. Not seeking permission. Just there. The colonel held the combat boots in his lap, the ones she'd left behind in a base hospital in Helmand Province 7 years ago, the ones he'd kept wrapped in military-grade plastic and labeled with her name because he needed something to remember the medic by, something concrete when the morphine haze made memories uncertain. He was lacing them now, slowly, deliberately, the way soldiers lace boots, 1 loop at a time, no rushing. He placed them gently at her feet. "Thank you for staying," he said. "Even when you had to leave." She didn't need to explain what she meant by anonymity, by choosing to be just a nurse in a quiet city where nobody knew Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes. The quietest warriors don't carry weapons. They carry knowledge. They carry experience. They carry the weight of lives they've held in their hands, and sometimes holding that weight in silence is the only way to keep breathing. The SEAL commander watched from the doorway, and when he met her eyes, he gave a single nod. The kind of nod that means, your fight is here now. Your people know. The world knows. And you don't have to hide anymore. If you've ever wondered what happened to the people who saved your life when everything else was failing, if you've ever been misjudged by someone who didn't know your measure, I want to know your story in the comments. What would you have done in Natalie's position? Would you have walked away from the uniform too? Subscribe to the Code Whisperers and hit the notification bell because the next story is about a paramedic whose past comes knocking at the worst possible moment.